I should begin by exclaiming a bit to be actually to actually be in the the house of the Royal Anthropological Institute. I can feel, after many years in the profession, as it were, a certain nervousness about being here. Anyway, many thanks, Bruce, for inviting me to make these introductory remarks. Bruce and I go way back to, we are old, as they might have said in the colonial days, old Sri Lanka hands. Anyway, I'm going to be brief. Obviously, you are here to listen to Orlando and not to me. But I have a few things to say, if you will allow me. I've now written out in various places my thoughts about Orlando and his work. The introduction to The Paradox of Freedom is one place, and chapter 4 of my forthcoming book, Irreparable Evil, is another. So it's not been straightforward trying to decide what exactly to say on this occasion, if I'm not to simply and unduly repeat myself. In the event, I thought I'd use the opportunity to reflect a bit on my own introduction to Orlando's work as an undergraduate at the University of the West Indies, Mona, in Kingston in the late 1970s. Because I think that what attracted me to the work then is what I still find enormously instructive, namely the senses in which Orlando's work defies easy reduction to any of the ready-made or normative languages of classification. If he is an historical sociologist, his preferred designation, he's also a novelist. If his work pays attention to concrete historical data, he is also attentive to the limits of data and the work of interpretation. If there is a materialism and realism about his interpretive orientation, it is also inflected by a moral and existential imperative. If his focus is specific, he is also driven by a wider generalizing impulse. And in all of this, the condition of the enslaved has provided him not simply with local insight, but with a meta-theoretical and world historical paradigm for the human condition. Orlando is one of those intellectuals who, agree with him or not, and sometimes I agree, and sometimes I do not. He is one of those intellectuals who it is important to think with and to think through. The late 1970s, when I first encountered Orlando's work, were turbulent years in Jamaica, when the Democratic Socialist Project of Michael Manley, after a brief period of euphoric possibility, was racing headlong toward its violent demise in October 1980. I didn't know at the time that Orlando had been an advisor to Manley, but had made his exit from that role in the chronic ideological turmoil of the regime's final years. This was a moment when the intellectual landscape at the University of the West Indies at Mona was reductively polarized along a number of dimensions. One significant axis of contention was that between the communist left, Trevor Monroe, Don Robotham, and so on, and the cultural nationalists, Rex Nettleford, Kamau Brathwaite, and others. Orlando belonged to neither of these camps. To the communists, he was a Parsonian liberal. To the black nationalists, he was an adherent of M.G. Smith's theory of pluralism. In reality, of course, Orlando was neither, or not exactly. His name, as you can imagine, therefore, was rarely heard in either of these circles, and his work was read when it was read, with a certain aggressive skepticism, except that is where one of my teachers, Clement Branch, was concerned. Branch taught a course called Caribbean Social Structure. It was an old course, but this particular year, Branch introduced a decisive innovation. Rather than plodding through endlessly the various institutions that might be thought of as constituting Caribbean social structure, economy, religion, political order, family, language, and whatnot, Branch organized the readings and discussions around what he thought of as the pervasive ethos of resistance that shaped the life worlds of these institutions. Branch, at least in those days, had a particular interest in existentialism and moral psychology, or anyway, existentialism as a kind of moral psychology. He would go on later to found the Caribbean Journal of Psychology. The first lecture started off astonishingly with Jean-Paul Sartre and the significance of phenomenology for understanding Caribbean historical experience. Many of my fellow students found all this completely intolerable, those who hadn't fallen asleep. I, on the other hand, was completely transfixed. And of course, one of the texts we read in this context was Orlando's first monograph, The Sociology of Slavery, published in 1967. Now, the focus of our reading of resistance in the sociology of slavery was not, as you might expect, the grand emancipatory narrative of the organization of slave revolts, but the final passages of Chapter 9, Mechanisms of Resistance to Slavery, in which, totally unexpectedly, Orlando suddenly leaves aside his historical sociology and raises the existential question of the moral psychological meaning of revolt. To the communists and cultural nationalists, this was an irrelevance. They were consumed with the relation between mere revolt and successful revolution. How to explain why in Jamaica there had been innumerable revolts, but no revolution, whereas in Haiti, there had hardly been any major revolts prior to the insurrection that leads to what we now know as the Haitian Revolution. This question was important to Orlando too, but here he was posing a very different and, to that point, unexamined question. In a social formation of domination, so rigidly closed and totalizing as plantation slavery, in which the personality of the enslaved was so overdetermined by the authoritarianism and mindless brutality of everyday life. How could a Creole slave, that is, an enslaved person who had never known freedom, who was born into generations of enslavement, come to refuse their condition? What did that inner moment of refusal look like? What was going on when an individual enslaved person said no, no more? What was being rejected and what was being affirmed? This was not a straightforwardly political question. It was rather a question about the moral psychology or social ontology of the individual personhood of the enslaved. Famously, in trying to come to grips with this question, Orlando drew on Albert Camus' 1949 philosophical treatise, The Rebel. As an undergraduate, trying to situate myself intellectually and politically, I was literally knocked sideways by this angle of intervention. In the context of the cultural politics of post-1968 Jamaica, this was not an emphasis that self-professed radicals wanted to explore. Moreover, what was patently clear, though never explicit, is that Orlando wasn't simply making a claim about the 18th century past, but also about mid-20th century post-colonial Jamaica. He was making a claim on the present the communists and cultural nationalists presumed was their terrain. Branch's course led me naturally, I might say in retrospect, from the sociology of slavery to Orlando's third work of fiction, Die the Long Day, published in 1971. Die the Long Day is the fictive companion of the sociology of slavery. It is in this novel that Orlando develops and further explores the dilemma of the meaning of the slave's refusal to continue being reduced to the abject and dishonored condition of a slave. And he does so fictively through the simply unforgettable figure of Kwashiba, an ungovernable own-way mulatto woman whose daughter Polly is the object of the perverse predatory desire of a syphilitic enslaver. What interests Orlando is the process by which Kwashiba finds herself in an insupportable situation in trying to protect her daughter against the implacable powers of the slave regime in which white men had unfettered access to the bodies of black women. Orlando is interested in the process by which the typical strategies by which the enslaved navigated the opacities of power, captured in the Jamaican saying, play fool to catch wise, which is the central animating folk idea, if you like, at the center both of the sociology of slavery, or that chapter in particular, and of Die the Long Day. When these strategies are not enough to save Kwashiba's daughter, the process by which Kwashiba comes to say no to her condition and to affirm the agency of her personhood. It was of absolute importance to Orlando's point, a matter of some discomfort to the communists and nationalists alike, that Kwashiba is contemplating murder, not revolt, let alone revolution. Kwashiba is decidedly not her near contemporary, Taki, the great Coromantee leader of the 1760 revolt. Neither is she the great heroine of the Maroons, Nanny. It is not slave emancipation that motivates Kwashiba. It is her daughter's security and integrity, and Kwashiba's maternal right to protect these. As she is about to set off on her path of doom, her well-meaning but somewhat timid lover, Cicero, seeking to persuade her against doing anything too drastic, reminds her that she is only a nigger, to which Orlando has Kwashiba reply memorably, quote, yes, me's a nigger, but me's a human too, and is only one time they can kill me, unquote. It is hard now to convey how profoundly unsettling and revelatory this speech was to me when I first read it in the late 1970s, and it remains unsettling and revelatory to me today. Namely, the question of the radical universality of Kwashiba's claim to the dignity of her humanity and personhood. No one else was raising this sort of question in the historiography of New World slavery, about the ontology of the black slave. Many people, perhaps most people, come to Orlando Patterson's work through his magisterial 1982 volume, Slavery and Social Death, a book of encyclopedic learning and complex synthesis in which he introduces the paradigm-altering idea that what ultimately defines slavery everywhere is neither the fact of its continuous violence, nor the fact of treating people as chattel, but rather the systemic natal alienation that results in the condition of social death. Some people, not enough people, have read his 1992 work, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. Again, a book of enormous learning and ingenious synthesis, in which Orlando shows how the idea, and more importantly, the institutionalized value of freedom in its triadic dimensionality, as he has it, is born paradoxically out of the historical condition of slavery. Far from being some pristine value growing out of the heads of Greeks in classical Athens, or those of 18th century Europeans, freedom has darker, more unsavory origins. Freedom for Orlando is a tragic value, everywhere tethered to its sources in domination. But few people, I think, recognize that Orlando's three monographs, The Sociology of Slavery, Slavery and Social Death, and Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, constitute one continuous meditation on the condition of the enslaved. They constitute a kind of integrated historical philosophical triptych. The two later books have a generalizing character. They aim at a trans-historical story of the human condition. They lend themselves to a language of universality, and therefore they appear, on a cursory read, to have left the merely local world of colonial Jamaica behind. But this is fundamentally mistaken. Jamaica is not merely the beginning. It is the suturing thread and the animating passion. Jamaica is never not there. It is like a constant vibration. It is precisely the excavation of the experience of the enslaved in colonial plantation Jamaica that provided Orlando with the inchoate vocabulary of slavery and freedom, and that enabled him to recognize their inextricable dialectical connection. And Kwashiba, therefore, is not a merely marginal fictive figure offering local or ethnographic color, but one source of a fundamental moral philosophical paradigm of world historical significance in the story of humanity and the struggle for freedom against domination everywhere. This, anyway, is part of what I want to say Orlando has given us. Thank you.
I want to say that was wonderful, but that might be a little bit sort of, narcissistic. But I do think that you've discerned important things that I've struggled with and watched with some dismay, others not recognizing, or quite often seeing just the opposite. And it's good, it's always a wonderful thing to have someone who understands in depth one's work, especially one's work over a long span of one's life. So thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you. I'm very grateful. I'm honored that you've done that. I'm very happy to, this occasion, should point out that I had a strange introduction to academic life and to scholarship generally, because I went to the University of the West Indies a decade or more before, you know, David, and I was supposed to be doing a degree in economics, which had little to do with economics. It was supposed to be in sociology, but the sociology was taught by two anthropologists. So that turned out to have been one of the best things that happened to me. One of them was M.G. Smith, who was, of course, a student here of Darrell Ford, and later inherited his chair at University College London. And the other was Raymond Smith. And so one was called MG, and the other was called RT. And the odd and wonderful thing is that they didn't get along very well. They rather disliked each other. But these are my two. This is a small university, mind you. I mean, there's nowhere to go except MGRT. So that was a fascinating introduction to scholarship and the ways in which scholarship can, sustain quite different perspectives and points of views. Eventually, unfortunately, they both left. So we're all, but that was after I left. But it was my introduction to the social sciences was through two anthropologists, and I got a full range. Then RT's more structuralist, Radcliffe Brownian approach, and NG's more culturalist, Darrell Fordian approach. And that was actually one of the best things that could happen to me. And as I pointed out last night, the influence was pervasive, and it has remained with me all my life. So this evening, I want to talk about a paradox, one of the things which David has kindly introduced, freedom. I need hardly remind you that it's the most central, most cherished, and most contested value in Western civilization. And so my objective is to ask, what is it? It seems an odd thing to do, given that everybody assumes they know what it is. And to suggest some reasons why it occupies this extraordinary position in the Western mind. How did the tight cluster of beliefs we call freedom attain such centrality? How and when and where was the value invented or socially constructed? And to anticipate, a few questions, as well as to, if I have the time, say something about the ways in which it lingers and is central, at least certainly to the country which considers itself the leader of the third of the free world, and why it is that it's such a contested value still. Now, for many of you, the very question, why is freedom so important, may seem odd, as is the attempt to find the origins and social invention of freedom. Is the existence of freedom not self-evident, you may say? Is not freedom an inherent part of the human condition, and therefore pointless to ask why freedom or how it was originally constructed? There are many people who confronted me on just this. So let me be blunt. No. The view that freedom is self-evident, and its implication that questions about its origins and constructions are pointless, in my view, is utterly wrong-headed. Although in a way it's part of how deeply buried the value is. When a value becomes very buried, you never ask about its nature and origins. And it rests on what I call the universalist fallacy, which besets a lot of thought in the West. This fallacy bedevils most accounts of freedom. Among some very smart people that I know, it informs the vast majority of works written on the subject, especially by political theorists, philosophers, and not a few historians. The universalist fallacy accounts for the prescriptivist nature of most studies of freedom. For if we assume that's an inherent quality written in the hearts of men, as Locke famously said, then all the philosopher or theorist of freedom has to do is to sit in his armchair, as did so magnificently Berlin, and speculate from a few reasonable premises about the human nature. He or she can then deduce what freedom is or really should be, and that's the parlor game which philosophers have played with this value. From a few reasonable premises, you can deduce what freedom is or should be. The study of freedom becomes a game among the learned to see who is cleverest in deciphering its inherent qualities. From this, it also follows that the history of freedom amounts to no more or less than the history of what very smart men and occasional women have reflected on the nature of freedom. From Plato to Zeno to Cicero to Locke, Pufendorf and Mill, and up to Berlin and Rawls and all the other smart thinkers on this subject. Now let me hasten to add, this does not mean that what philosophers have said about freedom is not really important. As we'll see in a moment, the method I use requires looking at them. And the simple truth of comparative history is that outside of the West, however, nearly all peoples, for the entire span of their history until Western contact, found no reason to celebrate freedom or institutionalize it. Other values, honor, love, nirvana, justice, warfare, security, the unity of heaven and earth, whatever, have preoccupied them. And I don't have to tell you, this is anthropologists. In only a few non-Western languages, in fact, is there even a pre-Western word for freedom. And when such a word came to exist, it's very revealing. One of the interesting things I did in the course of doing research for freedom in the making of Western culture is that Harvard has a lot of foreign students, as all great universities do. But I got them to sort of do some serious library work on the etymology of the words in their languages. And in every case, every language now has a word for freedom, okay? But the interesting thing is, what was the word? Or more interestingly, what's the literal meaning? And I love to have this imaginary, and someday perhaps you'll write a story about this imaginary exchange in which a missionary, having spent the last 50 years of his life and having converted less than 2 people, is going back home and has to do something useful, and so decides to write a dictionary of whatever, the Ponga or whatever the tribe is that he's trying to missionize, or sometimes great cultures, whether it's in India or China or wherever you. So you have this conversation in the bush. Okay, tell me what's the meaning of this word. Okay, what do you mean? Okay, this word means a pot or so on. They said, Okay, how about freedom? And your native says, well, what's that? And of course you know what that is. It's written in the hearts of many. May not say that, but that's the assumption. It's written in your heart. Okay, so tell me, give me an idea of what you have in mind with this word so I can translate it for you. And the native listens as he explains what freedom is and said, aha, I've got your word. Now, that word, which comes up in so many languages as a literal meaning, is something like licentiousness, which comes close, in whether it's one of the Chinese languages, certainly in Japanese and so on. The literal meaning of the term, it strikes people as something rotten. But of course, but anyway, it's an imaginary story, but I think it's happened. The real truth of comparative history is that outside of the West, there really is no term or word or idea. And I've had arguments. Of course, Amartya Sen strongly disagrees with me on this, and has written and has criticized me on this. So the universalist assumption has had dangerous consequences for non-Western peoples. For if freedom is an inherent part of the human condition, then it must follow that the only reason why we do not find it among the Azandi or the Iranians is because of certain obstacles in their environment, which once removed will result in the spontaneous outflowing of freedom. And what better favor could a leader of the free Western world do for such peoples than to send in our troops of liberation, okay, and to remove the obstacles that sit back and expect to be hailed as liberators. This is the theory of manifest destiny. Did I mention Iraq? And so let me begin by noting in speaking about freedom, I'm not simply speaking of an idea. And this is one of the first problems I have with my philosophy friends. But to a cultural module or model, a set of ideas and beliefs, and attendant set of practices. Further, these ideas and beliefs have a recognizable subjective coherence, by which I mean they can be shown to be meaningful and cohere hermeneutically. Cultural coherence, of course, in no way implies logical consistency. As we'll see, there's nothing logical about the real history of freedom. And this is where the descriptive analytic approach I adopt differs from the normative approach. So I want to begin by noting then that this is a deeply contested construct. What Gali calls an essentially contested concept. And drawing on one of my favorite philosophers, the Australian, at least she lectures in Australia, Christine Swanton, who's written brilliantly on freedom, and W.B. Gali, who's written on the nature of contestation. One of that is identified at least four ways in which freedom is contested. Freedom, it can be one, it's like all contested concepts, it's sort of multiply ambiguous without a common core meaning. That's one view of contestation, no core meaning. Secondly, there's an agreed upon core, but with many interpretations. Rawls comes close to this view, and especially this distinction between concepts and conceptions. Steve Lukes approaches the idea of contestation in this way in his discussion of power. It's a highly contested concept. Third, that there's a core but it can never be ascertained empirically. And that's Galle's view, the man who introduced the idea of contestation. But it always struck me as puzzling that you can have a core which can never be ascertained. It's a kind of pessimism which I'm never quite sure how he gets at that, although he writes brilliantly on the nature of contestation. And there's Catherine Swanton's view that there's no core, and she's a very subtle mind, this person, but a coherent cluster of meanings relating to freedom. And she pursues that idea brilliantly in her little book on freedom. And, well, there's my view. And that there is a caudal core to the idea of freedom, a conceptual triad, but it is fragmented, and the contested parts, as well as the triadic whole, can only be discovered through the history of its endoxa, a term I'll explain later, borrowed from Aristotle, sort of entrenched conceptions and beliefs. We demonstrate that this can be ascertained empirically, and what I'll try to do tonight. I draw on historical and contemporary societies, although initially, as David rightly pointed out, I came to this insight in studying one society, as all good anthropologists do, because my sort of tribe was 18th century Jamaica. And my approach following Swanton is partly indebted to Aristotle's endoxic method. Now, what is that? Aristotle, in the Topics and in several of his other works. And I'm not a great fan of Aristotle. As a descendant of slaves, how could I be? You know what he said about slavery and slaves. But he did have a lot of good things to say. And this is his method of how you go about studying something I found very valuable. You first observe appearances of things you're curious about, right? Their phenomena, as he calls it. You then collect the endoxa, credible opinions through historical work. And this is from the Topics. Endoxa are those opinions accepted by everyone, or by the majority, or by the wise, and among the wise by all, or most of them, or by those who are the most notable and having the highest reputation, unquote. In brief, the common entrenched conceptions or beliefs, credible or reputable opinions on a subject, acceptable to the many, or the wise. It's interesting, on the wise and the wise. Now, my approach differs in an important respect in that it adds, and the context in which they evolve or were socially constructed. So I'm going to begin at the end of my search by telling you what I found, what freedom is. What is this contested core? And the diagram, I hope they have. And it may surprise you, but I hope the surprise goes later. So at the core of the idea of and the construct of freedom is power. Power. It is it's often difficult for people to sort of grasp this idea, because in the liberal conception of freedom, freedom is often seen as the opposite of power. It's always meant, and we can see immediately what makes freedom different from simple power, though. It's essentially evaluative power. And it's a doctrine about what power is and should be. But the question then is, what is power? And as I mentioned Stephen Luke's already, and I could spend a whole evening going on about the nature of power itself. But after much confusion, a consensus has emerged, thanks mainly to the work of, I think of Peter Morris, the British philosopher, that power at its core is a capacity or dispositional property entailing the ability to bring about consequences. It's being able to do things when one wants to, whether or not one chooses to do them. The dispositional nature of power is critical. It's not a thing and should not be confused with the resources that make it possible, a common error of sociologists. Nor is it an event or the happenings that instantiate its exercise, which is a chronic error of political scientists, especially those of the behavioral school. For it's a capacity that may remain simply a potential. Freedom, then, is an enduring and highly cultured belief, or cluster of beliefs, about what powers persons should have and should have if they are to be considered free. It's a cultural disposition, meaning that it is not only enduring, but, as we'll see, highly institutionalized, a component element of a system of values. And this is where, by the way, even Amartya Sen gets mistaken, because showing me, as you can easily find in any part of the world, examples of some of the core meanings I'm going to mention, as Sen did in talking about Islamic India. But that's not, it's missing the point. The point is that it's highly institutionalized, a component element of a system of values. Freedom posits three interrelated notions of power. It has always meant positive power to do things in regard to oneself, others, and one's society. This is the most complex belief of the triad, and one that has caused most soul-searching and philosophical as well as historical denials and confusion. But once you get the idea, it'll explain a lot, especially about American history, some of the paradoxes. The idea that power is at the heart of what freedom means may strike many as strange, even outlandish. That's because of the tendency of liberalism, the dominant modern view of freedom, to equate all power with domination and tyranny, and to define freedom primarily in negative terms, as a resistance to power. We err, however, in interpreting freedom solely in terms of one tradition. In fact, the history of freedom shows that power has always been viewed as central to its meaning. Once you go through those endoxa, this comes out. Ironically, the modern philosopher who most clearly articulated this was none other than the person viewed as the preeminent modern theorist of liberalism, John Stuart Mill. Alert to the history of freedom, to its endoxa, Mill used the terms freedom and liberty to distinguish between freedom broadly conceived and what he called the principle of liberty, or liberalism's essentially negative version, which he so brilliantly defended in his classic On Liberty. In other works, however, Mill goes out of his way to show that freedom, broadly and historically conceived, is intimately linked to power. And they both have negative and positive aspects. And as Bruce Baum, a student of Mill, notes, they are, quote, linked in a continual interplay, not a simple oppositional relationship. That's Mill. From archaic times down to the last quarter of the 18th century, positive freedom always had a brute and a benign aspect, expressed in terms of freedom over and freedom to. The brute aspect is simply the stark valuation of the notion that one is free to the degree that one could do as one pleased with another, including, yes, the freedom to dominate and enslave them. Now, this strikes you as outlandish. I mean, this is a perfect example of this, especially from American history, which I'll get to in a minute. However ghastly this sounds to the modern mind, is the simple fact of the Western history of freedom that one form of positive freedom was experienced in the domination of others. The ancient Greeks, by the way, and we'll get to them in a minute since they invented this stuff, had no problem associating positive freedom with power conceived in this way. Actually, it takes little effort to understand how, for so long, this is considered perfectly normal in Western history. Americans, in particular, need only scratch the living surface of their history to understand how such a notion of freedom is possible. The greatest of the nation's founding fathers, all of them, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, men who celebrated and fought the world's first war of independence on behalf of what? Freedom. They kept using the word every turn. Freedom from the British. I wrote the world's first constitution enacting freedom and the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, by the way, did not originate in France. In fact, France got it from Virginia, Bill of Rights, which is written by a bunch of slaveholders. They were all large-scale slaveholders, the great freedom fighters of America. Liberalism was inspired by horror at this established aspect of freedom as power, hence its preoccupation with its negation. There is, however, a more benign aspect of the valuation of freedom as power, namely the fact that it enables us to realize our goals, which may be both external and internal. The fact that, as well as self-directed and other-directed, this meaning is also ancient. In a way, it's close to Amartya Sen's capability idea, which was, by the way, is not in any way new, but it's often cited as if it was. Benveniste, in his etymology of the Greek word for power, kratos, one root of democracy, as you know, found that in addition to its hard, brutal, cruel sense of delight in domination, the word, even before Homeric times, also connoted the attribute of superior skill, self-mastery, and authority in one's community. And this meaning was also identified with positive freedom. Today we speak approvingly of being, what? Empowered, don't we? It's a favorite word of feminists. Or autonomous, without any implication of dominating others, right? We also think of positive freedom as the capacity to have control over one's own life and to determine the kind of persons we want to become. This is freedom as self-mastery and self-actualization, or as John Stuart Mill observed, interestingly, in the subjection of women, the capacity of each person, quote, to govern his own conduct by his own feelings of duty and by such laws and social constraints as his conscience can subscribe to. Furthermore, this benign form of positive freedom also relates to others. We feel free to the degree that we enable others to realize their goals, in the process mutually enhancing our own experience of freedom. Modern feminists have strongly emphasized this relational aspect of freedom as mutual empowerment. But the belief long preceded them. In modern times, it is the centerpiece of popular Scottish philosopher John McMurray's doctrine of freedom as friendship. But as we'll see, it goes all the way back to ancient, even archaic times. Most importantly, the idea of finding spiritual redemption and personal freedom in fellowship with and action on behalf of others is foundational doctrine of Christianity, and I'll get to that shortly. The attempt, therefore, on the part of some quite eminent modern philosophers to excise positive freedom from the, quote, true meaning of freedom is not just historically unfounded, but conceptually obtuse. And we will not be wasting time attempting to defend this constitutive element of the triad. Okay, the second constitutive element in the triangle of dispositional beliefs we call freedom is the notion that a person is free only to the degree that they are able to resist compulsion, to resist power. This is a central tendency of the negative meaning of freedom. Okay. A great deal of intellectual heat has been generated around the idea of negative freedom, which I don't have space to get into. One point to be emphasized from the start, however, is that negative freedom, as ordinary people have understood it throughout history, is different from, although intimately linked to, positive freedom. It is often, though, erroneously observed by academics and philosophers who think they're being clever, to observe that negative freedom is simply a rephrasing of positive freedom, a turn of language with little substantive meaning. Freedom from want, it is claimed, easily becomes a positive freedom to secure one's minimum needs. But this is playing with words and only holds when we speak of negative freedom in this intellectually careless and vapid way. In the real world, and in the history of the endoxa of freedom, negative freedom means being able to negate or resist attempts to compel one to do what one does not want. This is not the same as positive freedom, because it is possible to have substantial capacity to resist compulsion, even where one has very little power over others, or power to do most of the things one would want to do for oneself. Although the point has been largely missed in discourses on freedom, it is remarkable how early we find this notion of the ordinary, real history of freedom. It goes back to Diogenes of Sinope. Quite a character, that. One of the founders of cynicism. I love this guy, who made this power of the powerless the cornerstone of his doctrine of freedom. He lived in a tub, as you know. He defecated in the marketplace, as you may not know. He masturbated in public and took particular delight in goading Plato and the other aristocrats of his day. But no one could touch him. Indeed, he was venerated by many in the city. One way in which the powerless enjoy the freedom to resist compulsion was by not fearing what the powerful did to them or could do to them. Euripides said it best: "No man is a slave who does not fear to die." Gandhian non-violent resistance is the admired modern instance of this. Suicide bombers is the ghastly contemporary counterpart. The idea was also fundamental in Christianity. Even before the creed learned to use martyrdom as a powerful weapon against the might of Rome, Paul was telling the early congregation, and we'll get to Paul shortly, he's my man, not many of you were wise by human standards, but many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. Rather, God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise. And God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human being might boast before God. Now, I don't know if this is the origin of the favorite Jamaican proverb of the peasants. They were illiterate, and they weren't reading this, and they had this even before the missionaries started missionizing. But the favorite phrase of the Jamaican peasants proverb, of which there are many, is play fool to catch wise. That's Pauline. But it goes to this idea of how the powerless can be powerful. Okay? Which, you find it, of course, in Francis of Assisi, and a lot of fun. Today, the homeless person sleeping on the streets of Boston is negatively free, even while having precious little positive freedom. He cannot on his own realize his most basic needs for survival and must beg for food. In several of them, in fact, are chosen this path. Several of them come from middle-class homes, and their families would love to have them. But any attempt to force them into home could result in the well-meaning relative or civic do-gooder being charged with kidnapping. One doesn't have to be powerless to enjoy the freedom to resist compulsion. All ordinary as well as powerful free people recognize that having freedom to do things requires the freedom to resist compulsion. And this is made necessary by the hierarchical nature of human societies. Okay. And thirdly, the third component is civic freedom, which is, of course, simply power sharing. Again, power is central to the idea. Freedom positively, exercise power, freedom negatively, resist power, and freedom in terms of the mind. In fact, the Greek word itself makes this absolutely clear. You know, demos and kratos. The people in power, it's direct. Freedom as shared people power enhances one's powers to do things, but it also controls the extent to which such positive power interferes with the powers of others by sustaining through laws the power to resist compulsion. It is because the homeless man or pauper has the freedom of people power and his protective shield of laws that though without positive power, he can still resist any compulsion to force him into homes or shelter or to the workhouse. Mill did not invent the harm principle. He merely brought to discursive consciousness, rather late in the millennia-long history, what had always been recognized as a fundamental component of the interactive triad. By now it should be clear that while freedom is central, it's centered on a universal human disposition, power, it is solely a distinctive belief system, a cultural complex, found nowhere else in the world until modern times. Now, when I say this, people often get very upset. What do you say? Are you being a sort of Western chauvinist? But of course, I've had this conversation so often, and it's become amusing. Although it wasn't so original, being accused of sort of celebrating the West. No, it is Western. But what has happened is that the West has played such a wonderful trick on the rest of the world that the rest of the world have come to believe, yes, it's written in our hearts too, and therefore we must have invented it too. And you're being chauvinistic in saying that you invented it. I've had this conversation countless times. There's people are outraged that I'm sort of becoming this chauvinistic Western, claiming once again that it all goes back to the Greeks. It does. But once I said to them, once you hear how the Greeks invented it, you may not want to claim it for your own too. Okay. So where did it come from? If you're reading that it's not written in the hearts of men, it's not something which erupts by just looking inward. How did it come about? So this is where, if you accept that it's a socially constructed value, and it's not a universal interior thing, it must have come about somehow, sometime. It must have been constructed somehow. So you have to accept what a lot of people still resist, saying that it was somehow socially constructed. Even smart people, I don't think I've persuaded Amartya, who is my neighbor, by the way, and I love him and I love his work and I cite him all the time. But I don't think I've ever persuaded him that this is the case. Especially my explanation of how it came about. So it was in Athens in the 5th century BC that these ideas and beliefs first congealed into the fused cultural product, the triad we call freedom, eleutheria, to use the Greek term. I've tried to show that its social construction was made possible by the relation of slavery. And I came to this idea intuitively. David has pointed out from very early. I was writing my dissertation. I spent 3 years right here in London at the Public Record Office, going through the archives on the experiences of slavery and slaves. I've tried to show that the social construction then was made possible by the relation of slavery. Slavery had to exist first before people could even conceive of the idea of freedom as value. That is to say, find it meaningful and useful and ideal to be striven for. A lot of cultures actually, in a lot of cultures, to be free in that sense is almost to risk your life. Before slavery came into the world, freedom was an absurdity so extreme that none but the most perverse of human beings would have thought about it. And had they done so, would have quietly kept it to themselves. It was dangerous, that idea. In a world, and many of you are anthropologists, you know, in many traditional societies, I would say, the important thing is to be integrated in a network of relationships and protections. And the idea of being removed from that is to expose yourself immediately to dire, dire threats. This is so because where there is no slavery, all that human beings desired was to belong, to be mutually embraced and protected by those individuals and groups they knew and cherished. In short, to be bonded, to be bonded. The relation of slavery, however minor, immediately suggested the possibility of a movement from this condition of pre-servile innocence. Large-scale slavery shattered it. So I said I have there so necessary but not sufficient. So I've spent a lot of time in slavery and social life showing that slavery was in fact universal. But I've said earlier that it is freedom evolved. It was socially constructed at a particular time in ancient Greece. So what's going on? So the idea may have occurred, but you'll keep it to yourself. Because it is dangerous. So when did it come about that idea, which every slave at some point must have desired, but then saw, better of it, not good. In biblical times, in the sort of ancient Near East and so on, where there's a lot of slavery. The best position to you to be when you were freed, and they were freed, the best position to find yourself in is not to go off. Say, whoop, I'm free, I want to be by myself, and so on. That's asking to get your head blown off or whatever. Is to remain in the household of your previous lord, under their protection. So what is the necessary condition for people to start saying, whoopee, I'm free and I'm going to I get away as far as I can from the former slaveholder, and I have the ability to do that? What the condition which made this necessary was the invention of not slavery, which is there from the beginnings of humanity, but of slave society. As I discussed last night, the difference between slavery per se as an institutionalized relation of domination between persons and slave society, which is a society based on slavery, in which slavery becomes absolutely critical for the system as a whole. Now we know when that happened. We know the first time that happened. It happened for the first time in Greece. Now, they say Athens, it may have happened in Crete and so on, but we have data, whatever little data we have is primarily on Athens. So we know that the Greeks invented that slave society. Not slavery, slave society. That was the necessary, I suppose, that was a sufficient condition. I was not my idea. One of the great classicists and someone who was one of my many mentors I've been lucky in my life to have. I spent a year under his tutelage when he was master at Darwin College in Cambridge, when I, in fact, started where I wrote the first draft of Slavery and Social Debt, was Sir Moses Finley, who I don't still puzzled as to why he did it, invited me to come and spend a year there. And it was one of the best things that happened. But anyway, Sir Moses was the person who sort of emphasized this and wrote quite a bit about the nature of slave society as opposed to slavery. One of the essays in my forthcoming book, Enslavement, goes into the nature of slave society, slavery. Many people have struggled with explaining it, going back to Marx, as I pointed out, here in his slave mode of production. Marx got the idea that there was that distinction important, and the slave mode of production, which he sees as the primary invention of the ancient world, was the first intellectual sort of attempt at defining something separate, new, and so on. And it's a powerful idea, although it was wrong in many ways. But if you want to know how I explain it, you can read the book, the chapter anyway. So it was the creation of slave society then, which was critical. And that happened in Athens. It's starting somewhere in the beginnings, of the 6th century. Well, actually, yeah, roughly around the late sort of sense, late Hesiodic Athens, but really beginning with the reforms of Solon and the set of radical developments that set in train. And I don't have the time to go into this, right? I mentioned something on this last night. Culminating in the full-blown slave society of Athens in the second half of the 5th century BCE. In which slavery was vital. And one of the worst systems of slavery, and I like to compare Jamaican slavery, which I certainly was the worst in the Americas. If I'm ever asked, is any system worse than that? The Laurian mines, which were reopened somewhere in the middle of the 5th century. Hell on earth. They were brought in there, these mines, work naked, they die like flies. But the state of Athens and the building of its democracy depended on those, that inhuman, those mines. Where did Athens get the money to build its navy, which is a critical part of his empire building? It came from, because, the state owned the mines, by the way. And it was a major factor in both building a navy and its imperial expansion, which went along with this liberty expansion, invention of liberty, but also in supporting the democracy that emerged during that time. How was Athens able to do something which even America can't? Sort of, they paid people to vote. Anyway, it was coming from these slave minds. I mean, this is this ghastly, horrible system. So the large-scale slavery then was a critical development. So under what circumstances the Greeks construct this unique tripartite cultural value? I and others, and by the way, I don't claim originality in this, have argued that they, at least with respect to the fact that it was Greece and the Athenians who developed it, have argued that the unprecedented existence of large-scale slavery in Greece and later Rome, as you see, was a necessary condition for its development. Poulenc, the German classicist in 1966, was the first sort of expression of this idea. Out of the evil of slave society came the complex, morally fraught idea and experience of freedom. Okay, and first and foremost among the conjunctural factors was the rise of Greece as a large-scale slave society, as I pointed out. Second was the emergence in Athens of an enfranchised farming population that had come close to revolt during the late 7th century, and as you know, which generated the Solonic reforms due to mass debt bondage and the threat of reduction to slavery. Third was the skillful leadership and renegade members of the Athenian aristocracy. Retroactively, as you learn, you may have learned from your high school history, maligned as tyrants and still are. This is one of the greatest pieces of maligning ever done. I mean, these guys were radicals. Anyway, who astutely negotiated a substitution of participative political benefits sweetened by a contradistinctive, solidaristic ideology of shared Athenian superiority vis-a-vis the unfreedom of aliens and metics for the redistribution of land, which was what the massive post-Solonic debt-relieved, but still land-hungry followers had originally really wanted. It's important to know the Solonic reform is often celebrated, but they didn't really, the aristocrats did not really give them what they wanted, apart from the fact that they were no longer enslaving their own people. But they didn't get the land they wanted. But they did this clever thing. Instead of economic sharing, they engaged in political sharing. Okay? In the process, creating the first male mass democracy. Fourth, there was the development of an ancient dual economy. This is a dual economy concept I got from Arthur Lewis, who was my teacher, in which a modernized farm sector of fruit farms and vineyards, okay, and an urban mining sector, both largely mined by slaves, coexisted with the traditional small-scale economy of own-account farmer citizens, which, fifthly, permanently relieved the mass of small farmers from the economic demands of the elite. This is a very unusual situation. This has never happened in history before. That a mass of people were, that both the elite and farmers were relieved of each other. That is just, and slavery made this possible. To recognize what happened here. These independent hoplite sort of groups, and they could buy their own arms and so on. All of which, sixthly, eventually created a dynamic urban social space for a large number of manumitted slaves and other skilled entrepreneurial aliens. Another thing which is really new and just extraordinary was the growth of an urban skill group, many of whom were ex-slaves, but some of whom came in as migrants, meticus. Aristotle was one, but a large number of them were slaves and ex-slaves who did a lot of the construction of Athens, which depended on their labor. And the system was just incredible, how much the Athenians were relieved of being fundamental things like policing. The entire police force of Athens, I still can't figure out how they did that one, were slaves. Can you believe that? When you think of the South, for example, and how the patrollers, the paratrollers, and so on, the idea of them being slaves is just unthinkable. But somehow they ingeniously managed to do that. The architects, the carpenters, the sword builders, and so on, they're all sort of ex-slaves. Amazing. The system then allowed for them to sort of practice the democracy which we celebrate. Further, there was the wholly contingent threat of Persian external domination, the successful repulsion of which had three major consequences: mass euphoria about Greek freedom and independence, the likes of which were not to be witnessed again until revolutionary America; the conflation of collective Greek freedom with individual freedom, given that Persian conquest had been identified with mass individual slavery; and the elite ideological appropriation of the triumphalist rhetoric of freedom surrounding the war by conflating it with their traditional honorific notions of power, glory, valor, warfare, athletic prowess, in short, arete, all that, as Pindar says, the free heart displays the point of this conflation. And the Greeks saw these three notions as a tripartite whole, focused on the notion of power. Thucydides has left us in no doubt about this. Most notably in his account, this is largely made up, but it's a matter of Pericles' funeral oration. The ancient Greeks, like the later Romans, and like all Europeans down to the late 18th century, saw no contradiction between freedom as the exercise of power and freedom as not being under another's power. To take a telling example, when Nicias addresses dispirited troops after their humiliating defeat at Syracuse, he reminded them of the glory of native Athens, quote, the freest city in the world. None of his soldiers, who had been whipped, and many of them died and ended up themselves as slaves, and none of Thucydides' readers would have considered it odd that Nicias' reason for going to Syracuse was to conquer and enslave it. In like manner, the 18th century British, while celebrating their own freedom at home so frequently, and being applauded by Montesquieu for having the freest of all constitutions, nonetheless thought nothing of enslaving my ancestors in Jamaica, in what was arguably one of the most brutal systems of slavery in history. And they didn't just do that. The great irony is, as I love to point out, when I grew up in colonial Jamaica, and every 24th of May, you know what that was? 24th of May, Empire Day. And all our little school children were waving all sort of the little flags, the sort of British flags, the Union Jack. We got ice cream, red, white, and blue ice cream. And we sang before getting up to, of course, the national anthem, Rule Britannia. Britannia ruled the West. Can you imagine a bunch of black sort of school kids singing that song and waving the flag? But they never waved the way. Britons never shall be slaves. I've pointed out many times that even as a 10-year-old, I thought that there's something strange about this song. Why would the British go on about never being slaves. I mean, who was enslaving the British? I mean, the British had gone around the world enslaving everybody else. So why are they thinking about Britain never being slaves? Well, you know, it took a long time to figure out what was going on. I think I finally did, but it's one of the sort of puzzles of my childhood that sort of carried over into my interest. The Greek constructed two other features of the culture of freedom that was to persist right down to modern times. One was the tradition of discourse about its meaning and significance. From very early, we find contesting views about what freedom really should mean, in which different thinkers emphasize. This is when then the doxa shifted from what Aristotle would call the ordinary to the wise. Okay, and we actually saw the point because Plato despised much of the endoxa which preceded it, and it's interesting what he did with it. The fact in which different thinkers emphasize or condemn thinking one or other element of freedom. By the 4th century, this tradition was well developed and informed a good deal of philosophical thinking. So what Plato did, of course, was to interject the idea. Real freedom was inner freedom. Okay. The other important additional aspect of the culture of freedom initiated by the Greeks then was this idea of inner. So first there was a discourse on it, an argument and contestation. Then the inner and outer freedom. This is very important, as well as contestation about the relative significance of each. Beginning with Plato, we find a tradition that emphasized inner freedom as superior to the outer physical freedom of the masses. However, it's striking that among the Greeks and throughout Western history, we still find the same tripartite idea when applied to the inner dimension of freedom. We'll see how important that's going to be. This is a major sort of construction. Plato's main contribution to the theory, to the history of freedom, was the principle of introjection. So he took the endoxa, which had emerged in conflict and tension between sort of, the ordinary people and the elites and so on. His transposition of the outer tripartite notion of freedom to the inner domain, with the same emphasis on freedom as power and control that was typical of his aristocratic class. Yes? Incidentally, it was the eminent Princeton classicist who put me on to this, really, Gregory Vasquez, in a fantastic essay called Slavery and Plato's Thought. Most penetratingly explored the remarkable role of slavery in Plato's thinking. True freedom, Plato argued, was escape from and power over the inner slave impulses of one's soul. This is just taken literally right inside. Others were to follow Plato, but as in the outer world, different groups of thinkers emphasized one or other component of the triad. Cynicism, for example, emphasized inner freedom as pure liberation, in stark and mocking contrast with Plato. Stoicism, which was the most advanced form of thought about inner freedom, also shifted the focus from Plato's aristocratic emphasis on control, on power, inner power, to that of freedom as an inner democracy. That was the essence of Stoicism. Perfect freedom was achieved when one's own spirit or soul of reason participated harmoniously with the rationality of the world soul. So it's this incredible introjection of the outer experience of freedom. But literally, the same triad was in there, right? After the Greeks, there were two other major developments in the history of the Western freedom. I'll try to be brief on this, although it's just as important before the Middle Ages. The secular freedom of ancient Rome and the concurrent development of Christianity as a religion of freedom. These were the three things, the other two things that fused and made it sort of.
it.
The Greek invented freedom as cultural value. It's no exaggeration to say that they tried hard to keep it to themselves. In Rome, just the opposite happened. And again, slavery was the decisive factor. From the period of the late Republic, Rome's dependence on slavery was greater than any other system in the ancient or the modern world, except possibly the Caribbean. Rome was a thorough, total slave society. Total. And it's hard for people to get it. Because slaves were everywhere. They were running the economy. They were running the lower levels of the administration, the imperial administration. They were in the farms. They were the schoolmaster. You wanted your child educated, you bought a teacher. They were everywhere. And they were in the imperial court, the Claudian court, okay? So during the Claudian, like most large-scale slave societies, manumission was an integral part of the system. In practical terms, however, the most important development in the history of freedom during Rome's time was a strong emphasis on negative freedom. Indeed, by the period of the early empire, the primary legal definition of freedom was libertas. That's read any of the great accounts. Liberty means not being a slave for everybody, freeborn or not. This is what the word libertas means. And there's been numerous, nothing fancy, not being a slave. Okay. In this regard, there's a vast expansion of the experience and valorization of freedom in the Roman Empire, precisely because slavery was so much more extensive there, and the free population, their descendants, such a large part of the population, some have argued they became the majority in the end. The majority of Rome by the early empire were either slaves, ex-slaves, or the descendants of both. Some people know. Rome also differed from Greece in another critical respect. Something sort of Roman magnanimity. It's the only way I can call it. Rome did something which, when you were made a slave, the lowest thing possible, and Rome was no different from others. The names they had for slaves. So the vocal instrument is one of my unfavorite. You were nothing. Rome actually had a version of sambo, the southern sambo, Graculus. And they used that especially for Greeks. Now, this is interesting. This is very interesting. Because they then, however, even though they held slavery and slaves in utter contempt, they did distinguish no other slave society has ever done before or after. When you are manumitted, you are also given the gift of citizenship. That is strange. From the point of view of the history of freedom, that is very, very strange. Because being a citizen was a big deal in Rome. As those of you who read St. Paul, and you know, everybody should read St. Paul, you know, whether you're a Christian or not, because he's the most important figure in the history of the West. But you say, well, how important is being a Roman citizen? They gave them that gift. Why did they do it? This has been puzzling me for a long time. Think about it. Think about it. Why did they do it? Now, I have a theory. My theory is that, certainly in the elite households, who are the people making the laws and so on, the typical slave was a Greek. Now, Rome was unusual in the sense that, usually in slave societies, slaves are coming from poorer and often the most illiterate parts of poorer, quote unquote, primitive peoples, the Germans and so on, the Huns or whatever. A substantial number of slaves in Rome, especially in the Roman elite group, were these smart Greeks. And in fact, the Romans acknowledged their superiority culturally. In fact, much of Roman philosophy was just a rewriting of Greek thought. So you have an interesting situation in which, on the one hand, you're calling these people Greculus, Zambos, they talk too much, they're full of it. But then you emancipated them. And then you could acknowledge the greatness of their culture. And Horace, as I pointed out last night, made this absolutely clear in his famous declaration that, Rome conquered Greece, but Greece then conquered Roman culture. This is a perfect. So it explains then the mystery, because you could then offer someone who you knew to be smarter than you are, who was educating your kids. Even though, they're also making fun of it, the Roman comedy, which was largely sort of rephrasing of Greek comedy. I mean, they're both slaves, the great sort of Plautus and Terence, the Greek sort of mischievous Greek adolescent and so on. But more importantly, that they could then, once they're free, recognize their cultural superiority and therefore offer them the gift of animation. That's my best explanation of why the Romans did this incredible. But it had fantastic effect in terms of the history of freedom. Okay, an important thing to note too about this, and this comes towards the third and final, is the freedmen. If you go to Rome, by the way, if you go to Italy, the most important remains from the imperial period was the monumental inscriptions. They're all over the place. And they're fantastic. Now, unlike Greece, people celebrated the moment they became free. And that's what all of these things were about. The freedmen became very important, and they celebrated. Sometimes they were mocked, but the point is, they celebrated their enslavement and their removal as the greatest moment in their lives. But they didn't hide the fact that they were slaves. In fact, they saw this as it was the ultimate sort of mobility story, right? And how did you guarantee your freedom? One, of course, the successful freedmen, many of them were quite rich, was to the way in which, having achieved freedom, you then solidified it, was, of course, to become a member of the imperial cult, the Lares Augusti. Now, what was this? This was Augustus, who saw himself as a god, having himself worshipped the imperial cult. And the way Augustus put it, his genius was that his imperial power, his genius, protected the freedom of those who became members of the Lares Augusti. Perfect freedom was achieved in an almost symbolic re-enslavement to the god, the man god, Augustus. And Augustus did consider himself a kind of man god if you read his autobiography, which is in stone. This is important to remember, but the celebration of liberty as the sort of freedom from slavery took some extraordinary turns. The use of the model of the master freedman by the emperors to symbolize, for example, sort of Galba's, the pileus. You know what the pileus was? It was the cap which slaves had to wear. It was identified with the caps. It's almost like sort of, what do you call it, silverware among the brothers in the ghetto, or gold chains. Anyway, the pileus. But that an emperor should use this, think about it. Isn't it bizarre? that this should become the symbol of imperial power. And Vespasian's use of the term adserto, just from a person who asserts the freedom of another or claims it as his own. It's to become pervasive then in the culture. Now, remember this, because let's move quickly to the third and final moment in the construction of freedom, in which it completely then dominates Western civilization. It's addressing the imperial sort of. We move to the Christian moment, which is the third movement in this slavery to freedom dialectic in the history of freedom. Now, don't forget this. Christianity may have been born in Palestine, which was in the sticks, of the empire. But Christianity was founded by the second founder, and the Christianity which came to dominate the religion was not the ideology of the radical Jewish rebel in Palestine. That would never have caught on. It was much too radical. It's what Paul did with it. Right? It's quite right to call the second founder. Paul essentially completely rewrote the whole thing. He completely de-emphasized Jesus' life. He only once quoted Jesus' sayings. Instead, what did he do? He made Jesus' death the central element of Christianity. But he did something else. In the sort of the birth and rise of Christianity, its formative post-crucifixion phase, the primitive church was dominated, by the way, by whom? By freedmen. Don't forget that, and slaves. But especially the leadership was strongly influenced. Read Paul, you see what I mean? And through them, the secular notion of freedom as manumission through redemption. So, redemption literally derives from the Latin redemptio, right? Meaning to purchase someone out of slavery. Pauline theology, Pauline's Christology, and I'm not the only one, I have some references here, so this is down there, simply sacralized the already well-established tradition of thinking of freedom as liberation from inner slavery. That idea was around already, by the way, making it the source metaphor of the young religion's theological reconception of the significance of Christ's death. In Pauline Christology, Christ's crucifixion was the price paid to purchase mankind out of his inner enslavement, which originated in the Adamic fall from grace. What's more, like Plato and the Stoics, and Paul was influenced, he had to have been influenced by the Stoic thinkers before him. Paul introjected in its entirety the tripartite, the triadic secular conception of freedom. Thus, he celebrated negative freedom in the letter to the Galatians. Okay? Now, by the way, the Galatians came first. In the Bible, in the way in which it was originally finally constructed, it came after Romans, but it's important to remember it came first in his letters. It celebrated negative freedom, the past, in a letter to the Galatians in a manner that would not be witnessed again until 19th century liberal thought. Okay? You know the passages? I'm always assuming that people know the Bible, but which I shouldn't. Just take it from me if you don't. I mean, it goes on about endlessly about negative freedom. You're no longer a Greek or a woman or anything. This is radical stuff. But he also, however, in the later book, which was published first, or put first in the Bible, but much later, is the last big work, Romans. What did he do in Romans? He celebrated the idea of freedom as power. with the most complete freedom, being realized only in the absolute power of God. In direct analogy with the Roman freedman's idea of freedom as power through surrender to the absolute freedom of the emperor in the imperial cult, and I bet my last penny that's where it came from. And although many people have sort of view me with some suspicion on this. So did Paul's letter to the Romans advocate the idea of true freedom as surrender to the absolute freedom of God. It was a direct transposition. Direct. If you read anything about the Lares cult, that the Augustus ensured that liberty you receive upon being manumitted through your surrender to his absolute power. That's true freedom, which is guaranteed. And in fact, in Romans, actually, Paul refers to re-enslavement to God. This is the term he actually uses. A lot of people can't believe this, so I simply say, why don't you guys just go read this stuff? It's amazing. Theologians have long agonized over the differences and possible contradictions between the negative freedom celebrated in Galatians and the austere positive freedom advocated in the letter to the Romans. However, as I've argued, once we understand how closely Paul modeled his view of freedom on the secular experience of the Roman freedmen, okay, the seeming difficulties vanish. Freedom as surrender to the imperial genius in the imperial cult did not entail the loss of their cherished negative freedom, which was rather complementary and ensured its survival. Similarly, the freedom that came to the Christian through surrender, indeed spiritual re-enslavement, to use Paul's terms, to the absolute power of God, when he finally came home, did not imply the abandonment of the negative freedom guaranteed by the salvific blood of Christ, who literally paid for you to buy you out of slavery to sin, which Paul espoused in Galatians. Rather, this lesser but still important note of the caudal triad is guaranteed by surrender to the absolute freedom of God. Nor did Paul neglect the third note of freedom, for it was he who introduced the idea of membership in the church as a participative sharing in the body of Christ, symbolically represented in the sacrament that will culminate in the Eucharist. What Paul wrote of the incipient church, forming the basis of a fully developed medieval idea of the Corpus Christi, could in fact pass as an excellent description of a democratic polity. The church was, quote, only one body and one spirit, in which, quote, members are of one another. This is Ephesians. Of the sacrament, he asked, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? That's the sense. It's a democracy, a spiritual democracy. That the participative feasting on the body and blood of Christ was an aspect of freedom was made clear by Paul when a few verses later in the same letter, he urged Christians to liberate themselves from their dietary prohibitions and not be intimidated by religious prohibitions for others. Quote, for why should my freedom be determined by someone else's conscience? So by fully incorporating the distinctive notion of freedom, Christianity not only became the first and only religion predicated on the notion of freedom, but ensured that freedom would remain a central component of medieval Christendom. It was the primary means by which the ancient intellectual heritage of freedom was transmitted to the Middle Ages and the modern world. And by the way, and I'll have to sort of come to a close here, you can read my... freedom was alive and well in the Middle Ages, contrary to what the historiography went on. But more importantly, the idea was kept in Christian doctrine. And the idea that inner freedom has nothing to do with outer freedom is sheer nonsense. Because right through the Middle Ages, radicals, sometimes led by rogue priests and so on, said, as you know, the elites were sufficiently sensitive to the radicalism of Christianity with its notion of freedom that they did the smartest thing possible to prevent it getting out, which is to not preach in the native language. That's so damn smart of them. It was all in Latin. I didn't understand a word of it. Right through, but it didn't work. Because we know in a chapter in Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, and in a long chapter I did on the Middle Ages for the fellowship for David Bryan Davis, I showed that there are lots of rebellions. The Middle Ages, and from Mark Bloch pointed this out long ago, was littered with rebellions, often led by renegade priests who simply say, hey, do you know what is being said there? Isn't this all about freedom? It's very easy to, this introjection of the idea spiritually. It didn't mean that it was permanently lost. It was very easy. And several, in a sense, modern idea of freedom was not a Renaissance kind of rediscovery. It's merely a sort of recognition of this and a powerful influence. Now, a lot of people don't realize that Locke was powerfully influenced by this. Now, you all know Locke's second treatise and so on, but most of Locke's writing were very religious. In fact, he had commentary on all the Gospels, and you should sometimes, if you're Lockean scholars, go read the commentaries on the Gospels. And, you get sort of the central idea of, Reformation, Luther's sort of central inspiration came in the essays on Christian liberty. You begin to see how powerful the idea was and influenced the modern world. Okay, well, let me say then that, so this continued, and I didn't go into this, so this is just my deep look into Paul. Paul uses the word freedom, and it's all there in the work I did. But the way in which Christianity then influenced secular thoughts throughout, one of my favorite classes is Kyle Harper. But just to finish off, in America, and it's just take 2 minutes, you can only understand America if you understand all of this. You can now begin to understand the confounding fathers. The way in which the sort of individualism of the Puritans emerged, alongside, of course, the South, for whom freedom was power. There was nothing new, although poor Lincoln thought so. You could understand now why a bunch of slaveholders celebrated liberty in the revolution, a revolution based on freedom. But the enigma of freedom in America becomes easily understandable now once you understand its background and the importance of Christianity in their thinking and so on. All the contradictions, women losing the vote and so on. And the famous address, the Sanitary Fair, which I'll end with. The world has never got a good definition of the word liberty, and the American people are much in need of one. We declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we don't mean the same thing. With some, the word means for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while for others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with others and the product of other men's labor. Here we are, two, not only different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of the things is, by the respective parties, called by two different names, liberty and tyranny. But in fact, if only, he was a great man, he read a lot, but not enough, right? And the enigma persists today. In America, the leader of the free world, the only modern nation to execute its citizens, including many young enough to be children, to others too retarded to know what's going on, the highest incarceration rate in the world, threat to privacy, it's all there, and one can begin to understand the contradictions. It's most celebrated value, those most hostile to the state. Freedom becomes understandable, this highly contested value is made meaningful by looking at the Indoxa and by seeing how it constituted this incredible triad, which is both internalized and externalized, and which constituted the fundamental, formative cultural influence on the civilization which we know as first as Christendom, rightly, but which we loosely call the West. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience. It's a long story.
Is there time for questions, or are we? How much time do we have?
Not too much, I would look for. Now, what do you think we need? 15, 20 minutes? 15, 20 minutes?
15, 20 minutes. I have lots of questions, but I will, since I have asked you lots of questions for many years, I will let them go and invite questions from the audience. Yes.
I enjoyed your point at the early part of your presentation where you said that you sent your foreign students off to do etymological
Yes.
studies of their own languages.
Yes.
And, so it made me think of a language, an African language that I can sort of speak. And in that language, there's a sense of economic freedom, like a free good, that, this is free, it doesn't cost you anything. And that word is also the word that's used for a free person, someone who is independent and not a slave. This is society that had quite an experience of slavery. So I wondered about to what extent or how much you see a kind of economistic element in this development, or is it all about power right from the beginning to the end?
Well, the economy is power, isn't it? The economistic is closely linked to experience of power. I mean, ask any peasant, that makes a lot of sense. So different people will sort of emphasize different means by which power is exercised or lost. But for many people, being poor and being powerless. Certainly in Jamaica today, if you ask anyone, they'll agree with that. But and especially Jamaican peasants who are very sort of much into their own sort of domestic economy. So I see no.
But was it part of the indoxa, as you say, in the early?
In looking, it depends on where you look and so on, but certainly among, yes, absolutely. As I mentioned to you before, the Athenian elites play this great trick. I don't know if there's some, but with this with this threatened revolution at the end of the Hesiodic period, sort of late 8th century, and from the threat of revolt, you had the Solonic reforms. Now, throughout the 6th century, what's interesting is that they kept clamoring for more land.
Yes, you mentioned,
That was the source of power and freedom. They didn't get it. What they got was democracy. I'm saying this is a clever trick, and they, and it worked. And when the more they clamored, the more democracy they gave them right on saying, we didn't even pay you to vote. And so they came to see that as the payments. Yeah, but they always considered, economic security as the fundamental. They eventually got it because the slave system created one in which, actually, there's now a growing, just within the last few years, economists have gotten into classical studies. And one of the interesting things they're coming up with is that throughout the history of all of Athens, in spite of all of this clamor and radicalism and so on, the condition of the ordinary person did not improve all that much. That's the latest revisionist view. I don't know whether they've bought onto it, but then it's a whole spate of studies are coming. The economists have just discovered antiquity big time. So, anyway.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's sort of connected to this, but so part of what you gave us today is in effect the story in Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, and central to that book, as well as the Slavery and Social Death, in fact all of your work, which a lot of people don't pick up on, is the centrality of power to the story you tell. And but one of the threads in the genealogy that you propose, that you don't develop, is the one that you sort of playfully, fictively alluded to at the beginning with the missionary story.
Yeah.
And it's the relationship between power, colonial power, I'm thinking here, and translation. Those dictionaries that the missionaries produced had massive effects in the cultural lives in which the missionaries lived. And I'm just thinking of something that Bruce will know in the story, for example, of British colonial Ceylon, in which there is at the end of the 19th century, as a consequence of in particular the Methodist missionaries in colonial Ceylon, the invention of a word for religion, and the invention of the idea of Buddhism as a religion. Buddhism, of course, was merely a doctrine. Like the Buddha's Dhamma was not a religion. But in the confrontation between missionaries and monks at the end of the 19th century, there is the demand for a word that will match the Christian missionaries' use of the idea of what religion does. And in that transformation, there is the emergence, for example, of young men's and young women's Buddhist associations. And so there is the learning of Buddhism in a way that in the 18th century or the 17th century, no one in Ceylon learned the Buddha's Dhamma. So those dictionaries have a major impact on how these cultures are organized. So part of the story you don't tell, which you gesture at with the missionary story, is what was the effect on non-modern, non-Western worlds of the enforced introduction of the idea of freedom?
Oh, powerful. I mean, freedom is now global. I mean, it succeeded. I mean, you have some strong reactions. One of my favorite was the famous conference in, where was it? In 1993, after the triumphalists, when the Berlin Wall fell, and you had the triumphalists sort of saying that, the end of history and all that crap. I mean, the world is now discovered and accepted Christianity. There was a conference which the Chinese led, a strange collection of bedfellows. The Chinese, the Singaporeans, and sort of Indonesians were all there. And they said no. And there's a strong reaction. The Chinese there are other ideas of freedom. No, they accepted the notion of freedom, but they were translating it. I mean, freedom means economic independence and so forth. It was a fascinating conference. A lot of people, you should look at it, because it was taking up this idea. It was still accepting that freedom may be universal now, which is what the triumphalist rhetoric of post-Berlin Wall was all about. You're all old enough, maybe some of you are too young to remember 89 and what happened afterward, and how that triumphalist movement with the nonsense about the end of history and all the rest of it. But the Chinese and quite a few reacted against it in that conference, and the proceedings are worth reading, because they're saying but they were both acknowledging, yeah, freedom, yeah, okay. But it means something different from what you guys are celebrating. And in a way, I guess she is kind of saying something like this himself now, but the point is that there is a sense in which the West did influence and won in a way, in the sense that at least you acknowledge there is something we're calling freedom, but we're going to interpret it the way we think it should mean. That is still influence, but it's an interesting kind of influence. It's simply saying, yeah, we acknowledge freedom, or they may even say we always had it. We always had it, but what we always had is different from what you how you define it. So the story you told is one in which, in a sense, your Ceylonese, your Sri Lankan folks are in fact acknowledging the influence, in one sense, but simply saying we're going to redefine it in our terms, wouldn't you say? So it's doing two things then, because in a way it's saying you can't get away from the West. They're there, they sort of, they've muscled into the whole world. We can't just pretend they didn't do what they did and made the changes that they changed and introduced the things they introduced. The thing is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to accept it in their terms? Are we going to accept the things that they imposed upon us in our terms? Because in a sense, we can never throw it off again. I mean, it's like you've eaten the forbidden fruit. The forbidden fruit of the West needs to be sort of cooked or so on. But this is how I see that. That in fact they didn't completely. I mean, the very fact that they said they wanted to find a way of how we reinterpret this, and they did something quite radical, didn't they? But it was also, wasn't it in a way a kind of acknowledgement of the influence?
It's an acknowledgement, yes, of the West power. But part of what I was wanting to get at here was that is your idea that the important dimension of the story of freedom is not merely the idea of the emergence of the idea and the circulation of the idea,
Yes.
but the institutionalization of a value.
Yes. Yes.
And part of
Yes.
religion is in many ways as important of quote value as to some degree of freedom. And what comes to be institutionalized at the end of the 19th century in the emergence of young men's Buddhist associations, etc., is a propositional, to go back to Gali, is a particular conception of what religion is, a reified structure of propositions that one can learn in institutional settings like the Young Men's Buddhist Associations, which was a radically new idea of incorporating in one's life the Dhamma of the Buddha.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that there is something about the structure and institutional character of people's worlds that was reorganized by having to incorporate this new idea of religion.
Yes.
So, people accepting the idea of freedom is not simply a cognitive acceptance of an idea, but the transformation of an institutional form of life in which a new value has to be set to work in the production of new subjectivities, in the creation of new kinds of institutional spaces, constitutions, etc., etc.
But I totally get, but I just want to add one thing. You know who you could describe perfectly in those terms? Our brothers, the Rastafarians. Didn't they do something like that?
Yes, in transforming the Bible. I mean, your story of the reinterpretation of the Bible and so on is a story. Can we have one more question here,
Somebody else, because in many ways what you just said was going to be my question, particularly around the point you made last night about the difference between slavery and slave society.
Yeah.
And it's just the point about when freedom becomes institutionalized, and it becomes an institution which is actually documented, rarefied. It's not just words and language.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
When does this happen? Yeah.
Absolutely, and we have enough data to see it happening. I mean, we even sort of with Philo sort of talks about this wonderful thing, freedom, after seeing a play by Euripides. So it's documented in remarkable ways. I think. Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah,
I'm answerable to other powers, so.
I wanted to ask a question about this, about how you might talk about, reflect upon this triangulation of freedom in a moment in your first novel, The Children of Sisyphus.
Yeah.
Where at the end of it, in the jungle,
Yes.
in the slums of Kingston, there's this controversy about about whether the ships are coming from Ethiopia.
Right.
And because it's conceived to be the perpetration of a fraud.
Yeah.
Yeah, that freedom isn't coming.
Right.
And the figure there, the Rastafarian leader,
Solomon.
Yeah, Solomon doesn't move. And his followers are saying, leave, because once the people know,
Yeah.
they'll tear you limb from limb.
Yeah.
And he says, no, because they have this moment.
Right.
And I was just wondering how you would imagine or interpret your own work in relation to this theorization of freedom.
Yeah. Well, that in a way was playing around with Camus. I mean, Camus' influence was very, very powerful in my life at that time. You know, I discovered him after leaving Kingston College, in Crossroads Library. I remember the moment when I picked up The Myth of Sisyphus. Crossroads Library had this section which I think was donated by the French embassy. And found this book. Didn't understand a word, I read it, but was moved by it. You know, you can be moved by things you don't understand. And I kept reading it over and over right through my undergraduate days. So, and the novel was partly started in my second year as an undergraduate. So that was really sort of exploring, you know, his ideas. In Camus, the Camusian sort of view. And it was one take on it, because I don't know if Camus ever did sort of solve the mystery of Sisyphus. Was it an illusion? That's what I was asking. But it's an illusion which we must embrace, because it's the only thing we've got. So that's my claim with Camusian, philosophy. But as you know, by the time I came to London and joined up with the New Left group, which had just radically shifted away and created, when I started talking about Camus, they looked at me with absolute contempt. Look, boy, you need re-education. Let's get into Sartre. Sartre had nothing but contempt for this guy. And so I came to a rude awakening right here, as you know, we got into Sartre big time. And that, I'm afraid, was the end of Camus.
But in a certain sense, you've read Camus because Solomon commits suicide.
Yes.
And Camus' point
Right.
in The Myth of Sisyphus
why I
is
don't
how
read.
to live without appeal.
Yeah.
And Solomon needed an out.
And out, yeah.
And
But then the Rastas had to learn to live.
Yes.
So that was
Yes.
the idea then, because you know, when Dinah came to run back to the arms of Cyrus, he said, you know, tomorrow we shall meet again in paradise. But tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, they never come. And the Rastas are still, believing that they're living that expectation. They don't commit suicide. But then, as we know, even though a lot of them are rich enough to get a plane fare back to Ethiopia, they don't, because they're living in this moment of time. Which, of course, can be seen as an interpretation of Christian doctrine. Because, you know, they were also, 2,000 years they've been waiting. But so, so that, I was hinting at that in that moment, because we know it's never, the ship won't come. But you live in expectations. And now Solomon committed suicide because I think, in a way, it's that got shot and he didn't believe what he said. essentially. And you have to believe what you say. You have to believe your beliefs, and he didn't. So he broke it. He broke it, Camus. Anyway, those are the ideas. I was an undergraduate, and I was playing around with some heavy thoughts at that time. But yeah.
Shall we bring this to a close?
I think we should thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Orlando.